Our readings this morning are taken from James chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, and 2 Corinthians 13, verses 5 to 10. So the first thing I want to do is point out something that we might be confused about. I have found many people to be confused about the word temptation. So let's take a closer look at that, because in James we find this word temptation in our reading there. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. That is down in verse 13. But let's just think for a moment about this word temptation. What is our understanding of this word temptation? So perhaps you could think about that for a minute. And there's a good chance that if you could answer me, you would say that temptation, the word temptation, has to do with being enticed. Would that be correct? Perhaps there are some of you who do have a different understanding of the word temptation, but I must admit that that is the response I get most of the time, that the word temptation has to do with enticement. But I want to show you something in James chapter 1 verse 14, that there is a very different word. There's a dedicated word for enticement in the original Greek. And it isn't actually this word that we are going to look at this morning, even though the word we are going to look at this morning is often translated as temptation. But you're going to see it actually means something else. So I want to take you first of all to this dedicated word for enticement in the Greek, and that is found in James 1 verse 14. And I'll just read verse 14 for us. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. That's verse 15. But there is the word in verse 14, dragged away and enticed. And that word is deliazo in the original Greek. It means to entice. So then, what is the word behind our reading this morning? And let's concentrate for a moment on 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5. So if you could go there with me, 2 Corinthians chapter 13, and we are going to spend some time on verse 5. Now, depending on what version of the Bible you have, what translation you have, it might vary, but I am reading from the NIV. So we have verse 5, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. All right, so there in verse 5, the first word, the examine word, is in fact the word peirazo. Peirazo, P-E-I-R-A-Z-O. And this word peirazo comes from the root word to pierce. And so you find that it is often translated trial or test or examine, but oftentimes tempted, which is a bit strange. And that leads us off in the wrong direction. So let's get back to the actual meaning of the word. Here Paul uses the word peirazo, and it is translated examine yourselves. So he wants us to examine, which is not a bad translation for that word, especially if we're thinking of dissecting something, piercing, cutting. That would all be within the meaning of that original Greek word. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. And then Paul goes on to say, in the next section, test yourselves. This is still verse 5. So he says, examine yourself, and then he says, test yourselves. Now, that's very interesting because those two words are two completely different words in the Greek. The first word, the examine word that he uses, is pyretzo, which means to pierce, test. And then we have a totally different word used in the second section where he says test yourself. So before I explain that and what that word is, let's go back to James. James chapter 1. Because there in James chapter 1 we have James using the same two words that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians chapter 13. But Paul uses, James uses these words in verse 1 and verse 2 and verse 3. So let's go to verse 2 for a start, and I want to show you the Greek words there. Consider it pure joy, my brothers. This is James 1, verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds. So that word trials is exactly the same word Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5. Examine. And it's this Greek word pyretzo, the one that comes from the root to pierce. That's the word. Trials of many kinds. And then let's look at verse 3, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Now, of course, in English we would think, that's probably a similar word to trial, but it's in fact the same word Paul uses in his second part of verse 5. So remember he said, examine yourselves, test yourselves. Here, James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials. That's a pyretzo word, pierce, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Right, so moving on from there, I need to share with you that the second word used, both in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, and here in James 1, verse 2 and 3, the second word, in the NIV, it's translated testing both times, is the word dokimos, or in the verb form dokimazo, dokimos, and that means to be approved, to approve. And it has major implications for us in our understanding of this verse, because I believe we have been for many years, I have for many years myself, been reading James chapter 1, verse 3 in the wrong way. And I'll explain to you how in the wrong way. Now listen carefully, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. So what do we take away from that in the English? We take it to mean that the test in itself, being tested, develops perseverance. But let's think about this logically for a moment. How about we use the example of me going for a blood test? So I go for the blood test, I go to the doctor's rooms, and the nurse does a blood test there. She inserts a needle into my arm, which I really don't like. Awful experience. And of course, then they draw blood and I turn white and yellow and green, and I suffer through it because I know it has to be done. They have to take the blood, and then of course it has to be sent away. So they then put something, a little band-aid over the little spot where they put the needle in and so forth, and off I go. And then I get home and I say to my wife, honey, I did so well. I endured the test. I didn't faint, and I came through the test very well. Now, what sounds strange to you in that sentence? Is it truly the testing, the test itself that I must take pride in having completed? Or what is it that a test is for? What is the only purpose of a test? Let me ask it that way. What do you think? Yes, the purpose of a test is simply to produce a result. That's all. The test just tests. We have to wait for the result before we pat ourselves on the back. Fine, it's a good thing that I endured the test, but the test in itself doesn't do anything. The test is only there to provide a result for us, a test result. The result is the issue, not the test itself. You understand? So now, how does this fit in with James chapter 1 and 2 Corinthians 13? Well, let's continue by reading then how it would be read, how it would be written in the original Greek. And I'm going to read it to you and see how, if you find any difference here in the way you've previously understood these two verses. So let's go. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face pyrazo, trials, tests, piercing of many kinds, because you know that the approving, dokimos, approving of your faith, develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, and so on and so forth. All right, so if we just return to 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5 for a moment, we could then pick up on what Paul writes, and you will find something similar. So I'm going to read it as it would be appearing in the original Greek. Examine yourselves, that is the testing word, the pyrazo, the piercing, to see whether you are in the faith. And then test yourselves. Well, it reads, approve yourselves. Do you not realize that Christ Jesus is in you, unless, of course, you fail the test? All right, so there we have first the word examine or test, pyrazo, and then the word approve. So test and approve. And those two words, of course, go together beautifully, because the test is testing whether the faith is approved or not. And I want to illustrate the point by going down to James 1 verse 12. So I will read it again to you the way it is written in the Greek. Blessed is the man, this is James 1 verse 12, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, testing, the piercing, because when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. I think if you read it in the New King James, I believe there it is even more clear. I have the NIV with me here this morning. So again there, it makes perfect sense. The test comes, and then there is a result which leads to the faith being approved, either approved or not approved. And here in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, if we just go back there, Paul actually mentions something very similar. And I'll read it to you. He uses the same word, approved. And let's go to verse 6. And I trust that you will discover that we have not failed the test. Well, the word behind that translation is eidokimos, that we have not been not approved, that we have in fact been approved. So it's all about the approving of the faith. The testing itself and enduring the test is nothing really to take pride in. The question is, what was your test result? Did your faith turn out to be approved or not approved? That is the question. Now, we need to go back to 2 Corinthians 13 to see what the test is for. And of course, Paul makes it beautifully clear to us. What is the test testing? So when we think of our faith being approved, I might ask the question even to yourselves right now. Think for a moment. What are the things that you would say approves your faith or proves your faith? Some might say, well, I go to church every Sunday. Some might say, I pray every day. Others might well say, well, I read my Bible every day. Or some might say, I speak to Jesus all the time. And I offer those things up as proof of my faith. Well, it's not quite what Paul shares with us here in 2 Corinthians. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5 to see what he says the test is testing. What causes your faith to be approved? Now listen carefully. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Approve yourselves. Do you not realize that Christ Jesus is in you, unless, of course, you fail the test? And then he goes on to say, and I trust that you will discover that we have not failed the test. So what is it that Paul says proves your faith? Well, it is clear from that verse that he says, if Jesus Christ is found in you, that is what proves your faith to be genuine. Now, what exactly is it that Paul is wanting us to test? That is the question. What is it that he says is going to approve us? Approve our faith. Let's go look at it closely. And I'll read verse 5. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. How does one do that? Test yourselves, he says. Do you not realize that Christ Jesus is in you, unless, of course, you fail the test? So what is he saying we need to test for if we want to test our faith? Is it our ability to endure? Is it this? Is it that? Is it praying every day? Is it reading the Bible constantly? No, not at all. It's simply whether Christ Jesus is in you, he says. That is the test. So let the incision be made, let the piercing be done, and whatever comes out there will show you whether Christ is inside or not. And of course now we find that if we were to take the traditional idea that we have of temptation, because the interesting part is that even in Matthew, where it speaks of the temptation of Jesus, Satan took him up to a high place to be tempted, the same word is used, the pyrazo, the piercing word. So let's think about the devil's modus operandi then. How does he go about his business? How does this word tempt or test, how does he use it? Well, I suppose we could look at it like this. Remember now, the original word pyrazo has to do with testing, piercing, to see what is inside. So an incision is made to see what is inside. So that in itself is not the enticing at all. That's a different word, as we have learned this morning. The tempting is just to see whether something is possible or not. First, he has to establish what is inside. So he makes an incision into us, and if he finds Christ there, he runs. But if not, then he knows he can continue the rest of his process. Isn't that amazing? And again here, this is exactly the same word Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 13 verse 5. Examine yourselves. Make the incision. See what is inside. Is Christ inside? If he is, good. There your faith is approved. If he is not, then that faith of yours is not approved. There is nothing else that can approve it other than the very life of Christ indwelling us. Amen.